Hello and welcome to the current installment of our webinar series on COVID concerns and homelessness, this one focusing on policing, incarceration, and COVID-19. I'm Eric Tars, I'm the legal director here at the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty, and we are very excited to bring you this very timely conversation today. Today we've got a really great lineup of panelists with expertise from all different aspects of the homelessness system, and we will be starting with some background, looking at some of the ways that policing, homelessness, race, and COVID-19 are intersecting. We'll hear from a kind of social worker perspective, which is being increasingly called for as we talk about defunding the police. What are we supposed to be funding instead? We will hear about what's going on in prisons and in incarcerated settings right now, and we will hear about where we can go from here and what policies we can be demanding in order to bring more equity into our systems as a whole, and especially into justice systems. I wanted to point out that today's webinar is being recorded, so if you have any concerns around that, just be aware that it will be recorded. It will be also available after, and we'll be sharing the link with everybody who registered. If there's any questions that folks have, then you can use the question box on your screen and type it in there. We may have the ability to do verbal questions at the end, for which you can use the hand raise function. But the better one, the way that we can actually record your questions in case we can't get to it during the webinar, is by typing it in the box, and then we can follow up with people afterwards. And although we encourage you to be paying close attention to everything our presenters are saying today, if you want to tweet along, live tweet what some of the presenters' brilliant remarks are going to be, you can use @NLCHP homeless, and we are also always using hashtag housing not handcuffs, and you can use any other tags you want. So with that, I am going to turn it over to our first speaker, Carlton Martin, who is the pro bono coordinator at the Law Center, and let him lead it off.
Well, thank you, Eric, and thank you, everybody, for listening in today. We're going to cover a lot of information in a little bit of time, so I will be speaking really quickly, but just know that a lot of the statistics and factoids that that I'll talk about today are going to be in the Housing Not Handcuffs report. Also, the solutions-oriented part of the webinar is going to be covered by our last two speakers. Next. So in the next slide, I have a short story to tell, and it's about the 1 in the 3. All right, so there's a very popular statistic from the 2000s that said that 1 in 3 Black males will be experience time in the penal system during their lifetime. And I want to tell a short story about 2010. In the summer before my 2L year in law school, I worked for the Indiana Court of Appeals as a judicial clerk. And there was a group of us, and one of the things that we did was as an activity that was scheduled for us in our internship, was to go into the corrections facility in the state of Indiana. So we go there, and part of the experience was to walk through with the warden's representatives, look at it, observe everything, and we went through 3 units. So when we go through the first unit without a hitch, nothing happens, no events. But as we walk through the second unit, all of a sudden I hear somebody yelling out my name real loud. I hear Carlton, you know, and so I look around. I'm like, well, they probably were talking to somebody else named Carlton in here. Maybe there's someone they're talking to. They're not talking to me. Then they said it a second time. All right. Now, when they said it the second time, my eyebrows raised and I looked around even harder. And when the third time, I finally looked to the back of the room and I saw somebody that I used to run track against in high school who was in there. And I'm not going to say their name, but we walked up to him. I had a conversation. I was talking to him, just regular, you know, just convo, not asking about what he did to get there, anything of that nature. And then the rest of the cohort walked off. As I come back to rejoin the cohort, you know, you can imagine the looks that you know, some of them were giving me, like, well, you know, how do you know this person and all this other stuff. But I had to walk. We was instructed not to talk to them and walk around. But that was somebody I knew. And as we get to the third one, you guessed it, the same thing happened again. Okay, so as you look at this statistic, it's the inverse of the 1 in 3, right? The one person, me, was the one that was not incarcerated, and the other 2 were. And so it's an interesting perspective to see that just how close a lot of us as Black males are, even if we do not are not in prison ourselves, are really engaged with the system by our friends, our family, people we know. So as in the next slide, we talk about the you know, we have to keep in mind, you have to keep all this information in context. We talk about race, homelessness, policing, and mass incarceration. Race cannot be separated out from any of them. It is a part of the whole equation. So when you look at the birth of policing, you're talking about the concept of modern day policing is coming from slavery, all right? The slave patrols and night watches. They were designed to control the behaviors of minorities, particularly Native Americans and Blacks. All right. And this legacy of slavery is important because if you ask the question, well, why are so many Black Americans at the bottom of almost every statistical category? All right. When it comes to wealth, academic achievement, incarceration rates, you name it. I have some things up here on the slide, some events, the Middle Passage, all right, chattel slavery, that whole entire institution. All right. Unfulfilled promises of the Reconstruction period, the early 1900s scientific assault on the intellectual capacity of Black people. All right, that is not mentioned enough. Domestic terror, the domestic terror of Jim Crow and the war on drugs and mass incarceration, which brings us into the modern day. So further in this connections between it all, there's a wealth gap, right? A recent study by the Institute of Policy, a recent study by the Institute of Policy Studies and Economic Development notes it would take 228 years for the average Black family to amass the same level of wealth for the average white family holds today. And that's if everything stops, okay? That's if everything stops and we can play catch up, all right? Well, we know that's not gonna happen, all right? So that gap is something that, unless there's action taken, is gonna remain. So as you can see here, when you have no wealth, you have very low resources for essentials, you are vulnerable to what's life interruptions. COVID is the ultimate interruption, all right? And so when you see Blacks, people, and you're analyzing and say, well, why are so many dying from COVID and what's going on? Keep the wealth gap in mind. Keep these incidents that I'm talking about in mind because that can provide you some insight as to why that is the case. And why it's the case that when you have low wealth, you're at greater risk of naturally experiencing homelessness, jail, incarceration, and the cycle continues. All right. The end point of aggressive and improper policing is not mass incarceration and being locked behind bars. When you don't repay your debt to society and it's a slate white cream or clean white slate, it's the near permanent locking into a bottom caste of society. That's what's happening. So moving quickly to this next one, Black people make up 40% of the homeless population, but only 13% of the total population. That's a crazy number. And if you combine it with Latinx, Native Americans, Pacific Islanders, and others, people of color, that makes it 60%, even though we're not the majority. All right, so that should tell you, that should alarm, the bells should be going off right now that is a problem, right, that needs a specific solution. Black people make up 33% of the U.S. adult population, or adult prison population, but only 13% of total Black people totally. So how is it a third? How is it a third? Well, I just told you some reasons why. Now, as we go into the next slide, you see some of the race, some of the history that we can touch on really quickly. But now we ask ourselves, well, what is it? What is criminalization, and what does the law center mean when we say criminalization? Criminalization is essential. You see the definition here, but think of it in the other part. These are activities, right? People are criminalized for activities that we all have to do. We all have to sleep. We all have to sit. We all have to exist somewhere in space. But if you have resources, you can pay for private space to exist in, right? When you don't, you have to exist in public, right? And these laws that we're going to go through are targeted to criminalize for doing these activities. Criminalization, as we already have said, that the mass incarceration, right? The United States incarcerates more people than any nation in the world. Any nation in the world. 5% of the world population in the United States, 25% of the world's prisoners. You'll hear more about that. Since 1977, all right, crime has continued to fall, but police budgets have tripled. All right, there's numbers that citing up to $115 billion a year spent on law enforcement. Okay, $115 billion. Nationwide, people experiencing homelessness, okay, are up to 11 times more likely to be arrested than a housed person. Okay, so that's an intersection between being out and exposed in public and the police. Also, the Black arrest rates for offenses like vagrancy, for example, is at least twice as high as the white arrest rate. Now, if you look at places like Los Angeles, California, Black residents making up 46% of all arrests and bookings. So these numbers and these racial disproportionality in enforcement of the law when it comes to homelessness, when it comes to race, they're alarming. All right, they're alarming gaps. The last thing is the collateral consequences, right? When you go to jail, when you go to prison, you have a wide range of collateral consequences that come after that debt has supposedly been paid. Okay, now when you are experiencing homelessness, you lose your chronic status under the federal legal definition. All right, when you spend more than 90 days in jail or prison, when you come back out, you may have your options for places that you can live or can get shelter are limited because you're no longer considered chronically homeless, right? And so when you are coming out of incarceration, you don't have any place to stay, homelessness is 10 times more likely after arrest. So it's illegal to be homeless, essentially, is what we're arguing in Housing Not Handcuffs. Criminalization is going up. All right, it's not going down, it's not flattening, it's going up. In the Housing Not Handcuffs report, we studied over 187 cities nationwide. A list of statistics here, 60% of those cities, there's been have a law in place that bans loitering and vagrancy. You have a 103 increase since 2006. These vagrancy and loitering laws running short on time, but if you look up in the case, Indiana versus Timms, it's a Supreme Court case. Justice Ginsburg actually, in one of her quotes, connects Black codes, vagrancy laws, to Black codes. All right, so there's another connection to how slavery and some of the laws that we have in place in the modern day are still affecting us. There's a 72% ban of camping in public, 70% increase since 2006. 55% ban of storing property in public. 50% of those cities also ban living in vehicles, which is a 213% increase since 2006. All right, and the cruel thing about the vehicle laws is, as you know, that is the last place that people have to go. Okay, and so fines, fees can be racked up from having your car in the wrong place. And though there is no comprehensive data on the extent of criminal justice debt owed, they believe it's in the billions of dollars. And those dollars are not going to get paid back. So we need to think of another way to deal with these issues. Next slide. The is coming to a close. The next thing that we categorize as of laws that are criminalizing deal with banishment. If you think of banishment, essentially you see move on orders, you see stay away orders, trespassing, sweeps. All of these law enforcement tactics essentially just shuffle people around from one area to the next. Okay, it doesn't make people safer. It doesn't solve homelessness. It is not an effective way to deal with it, because shuffling someone experiencing homelessness from one place to the next through a move on order, through a stay away order, through sweeping and rounding up all of their personal belongings, all right, and destroying it and confiscating it, it doesn't help anything. It doesn't help solve the problem. So each one of these law enforcement tactics are ineffective, and which brings us to the last thing that is more effective, right? When we talk about defunding police as a law center, and as some advocates will argue, one argument is that we reallocate sources, resource or money in the budget that goes for law enforcement into housing, into social services. All right, so right now law enforcement makes up the majority of most city budgets. We know that, but housing and even supportive housing would cost, with services, cost 2 to 3 times less. So it costs less to house than it does to go through some of these criminal justice tactics. So if we defunded the police and put those dollars towards housing and services, we would come out with happier, healthier residents, better, safer streets, and we could even save money, right? Save money in the process that can go into even more helpful solutions. And so housing not handcuffs is a win for everybody. And lastly, then we'll move on to Eric, is that the quote at the top is very important, right? At several historic moments, right, the trajectory of racial inequality could have been altered dramatically, but at each juncture, the road chosen did not lead to a just and fair America. All right, so we are in that moment. We're in this moment right now. And when you talk about altered drastic changes, one thing that's, COVID is terrible. A lot of people have died. We're still living under that threat. But one thing that the COVID-19 response has showed us is that the government and people, we all can make changes, policy changes, very quickly and very drastically and with a sense of urgency. And so homelessness, racial inequality, poverty, and dealing with these epidemics in our country needs the same sense of urgency. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Carlton. And I just wanted to bring everybody up to date on 2 recent responses to the criminal justice crisis in America. The first is the Justice in Policing Act, which there's been already conversations about on the Hill, hearings yesterday. One important aspect of that act, in addition to all the others, is that for the first time, this act would require federal data collection on the housing status of civilians against whom force was being used by the police. So while the act as a whole does not solve all of our problems and is not sufficient, this one particular piece is worth noting, worth calling your Congress folks about and encouraging them to maintain that language in the act as things get negotiated, and emphasizing the importance of it, because right now we simply don't have this data. We don't know how often force is being used. We don't know often housing status is not tracked. So it's really important for us to be able to get this data and for use this opportunity to get this as the first requirement of federal data tracking, and then be able to expand it to other areas such as arrests, incarceration, etc. Secondly, folks may have heard just yesterday that President Trump issued an executive order on on law enforcement, and under normal circumstances, some of this language would be welcome, that it's the policy of the U.S. to promote the use of appropriate social services as a primary response to those who are suffering from mental health issues, homelessness, and addiction, and that officers should be properly trained for such encounters. That all sounds very good. However, when we look into it, we see that the Attorney General is directed to identify and train and increase the capacity of social workers working directly with law enforcement agencies and to provide guidance. Now, Attorney General Barr has already had an executive order issued to create a task force that one of the subgroups in that is looking at mental health, homelessness, and addiction, this exact same formulation, only that working group, which is probably largely going to lead this response, is made up entirely of law enforcement officers, no community representatives, no voices from people who have experienced homelessness. And one of the folks on that working group is the sheriff from Pinellas County, where we know there's an internationally condemned shelter facility that is being used basically as a jail light, where people are directed under threat of going to the regular jail and run through very paternalistic services in order to be deemed housing ready. This also directs the Secretary of Health and Human Services to work with the Attorney General and the Director of Office of Management and Budget to prioritize resources. But this is, again, not looking at housing, which is what is needed. If all of these things could work together, if social workers could go out backed with the evidence-proven housing first resources to be able to place people into housing, that would be one thing. But what we see here is most likely an attempt to grow, even if using social workers rather than police officers, a shelter system which has not worked to end homelessness and, in fact, is elongating it. So these are our concerns around this, and this just came out yesterday, so this is our kind of quick analysis, and we wanted to make sure that people were not accepting this at face value. With that, I will turn over to Melissa, our Networks and Communications Vista, or Events Vista, to talk about some of the additional aspects of what we would see as alternatives to policing rather than what we have in the current system.
Thanks, Eric. So if we move on to our next slide, I just wanted to bring it to your attention that police are not social workers, they're not medical professionals, they're not educational specialists, nor are they mental health counselors. And police officers should not be responsible for everything, and they're not trained to address everything. There are crises playing out daily in our streets across the country, and they are diverse, yet people tend to respond to them the same. It could be someone suffering from a drug overdose. It could be someone writing Black Lives Matter on their own property. It could be someone dealing with an acute mental health episode. And you see in the picture below of a young man by the name of Mubarak Suleiman. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia at the age of 19 years old. His parents would often contact police because they had no alternatives of dealing with his mental health. While he was out in the community, he was suffering from a manic episode, and police were called. They were not aware of his mental health. They did not see any. They did not detect any emotional distress. As a result, he was shot 7 times and was dead at the scene. Another example of this that recently happened, if we go on to the next slide, is Denzel Washington. a prime example where he saw a Black man in distress who also is experiencing homelessness. And he saw that he was concerned about his safety. So he came in and he was basically a barrier between the officer and the Black man. In the situation, you see where Denzel Washington is using a form of crisis intervention as a means of de-escalating the situation to calm the man down, in order for him to, get his needs. Services like this are definitely needed across the country. And a good example of this is in Eugene, Oregon. It's a program called CAHOOTS, which stands for Crisis Assistance Helping Out in the Streets. It's a program that provides free confidential services in that region, and it consists of mental health crisis workers and emergency technicians. Their services are to provide crisis counseling, substance abuse, suicide prevention assessment and intervention, grief and loss, housing crises, resources, and referrals. And in addition to any additional resources that they see that the person might need. So how they work is that they collaborate with the dispatch within that region, and you call the non-emergency number, and from there they go out into the community and assess the situation without the use of police officers. Now, if safety is in jeopardy, of course they would call them, but again, they are supporting the person at need. And by having these resources, it would definitely prevent the person who might be experiencing a mental health crisis at the time or is currently experiencing homelessness, because let's be real, these tickets add up. Let's say they might be in the streets, they could get a ticket for trespassing. They could get a ticket for, using the bathroom outside. So this all comes along with obtaining housing, because when a landlord is doing a criminal background check, they see these things and they think they associate someone experiencing homelessness. Oh, they might destroy my property, or they might not be able to maintain their household because of these ticketings, but they were being criminalized for being homeless and not having anywhere else to go. Same thing that goes with housing vouchers. Having firsthand experience working with women who have experienced homelessness, a lot of them have petty crimes. And once they obtain a voucher, the program will look in and do their own background check and say, okay, well, she did that, this, that, and the third. Maybe she won't be fit, to obtain housing, which brings them back to the bottom of the barrel, and will have them go out to an expungement lawyer trying to get assistance, will prolong them to obtain housing. So by having a program such as CAHOOTS, will eliminate that issue, and instead will focus on that housing is entirely a human right, and that instead of using police, we should address that housing is a need for everyone, especially people that aren't housed during this pandemic. People cannot safely shelter in place, as well as longer term problems with racial disparities in housing and policing. If everyone was housed, we wouldn't have to create laws to criminalize homelessness, and we wouldn't need police to lock up people for simply being homeless. And if everyone was housed, they could focus on their health, the livelihoods of their children, obtaining education and trying to better their community, and making their community stronger and more resilient. And an example of this in the state of California, they introduced an amendment that acknowledges and recognizes that housing is in fact a human right. And there are many countries in the world that are implementing that housing is a human right. And so if we focus on moving from the era of civil rights to human rights, is how we fulfill Martin Luther King's dream. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. With that, we'll turn it over to Josh Tom, the Interim Executive Legal Director and Legal Director of the ACLU Mississippi, to talk about how this is playing out in Mississippi.
Thanks, Eric. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be here. The two issues that I'm going to discuss today fall within the broader conversation that the country is currently grappling with. Number one, what do we want police to do? And number two, racism and racial inequities in our country and criminal legal system. So the first issue that I'm going to discuss is I'll ask the question, do we want police to deal with homelessness, poverty, and addiction? Jackson, which is the capital city of Mississippi, uses brutal tactics to harass and abuse homeless people, often for panhandling. Using the police on these issues has been ineffective and arguably a misuse of resources in Jackson. The second issue, Mississippi has for years relied on mass incarceration policies. At the same time, it has cut the budget of the agency, which is supposed to take care of all of these people in prison. So this combination of over-incarceration and underfunding has resulted in horrific, inhumane conditions in our prisons in Mississippi, which are disproportionately filled with Black and brown people. So the ACLU of Mississippi has been working with the Law Center for the past several years now on the issue of homelessness and panhandling in Mississippi. Through advocacy, we've been successful to date of having 8 cities voluntarily repeal their panhandling ordinances. During this advocacy campaign, we began to investigate Jackson, the capital city, over how its police were enforcing the panhandling ordinances. We discovered that Jackson uses the panhandling ordinances and other laws to harass, abuse, arrest, and jail homeless people, often when they're panhandling. Using police to deal with homelessness in Jackson has not solved the problem. Instead, these people are subject to a cycle of abuse and interaction with the police and criminal legal system that they're unable to get out of. Today, we're seeing, as a result of the murder of George Floyd and others, the American people reevaluating what the purpose of police is. As a part of this evaluation, I think we should ask ourselves whether we are getting what we pay for and whether police are effective at solving the issues we ask them to address. Police officers have not been effective at addressing poverty, homelessness, and addiction in Jackson. Let's talk about a few stories that people have told us about this enforcement in Jackson. 2 homeless residents of the city were sleeping under a bridge on a very cold night. A Jackson police officer, notorious for his abuse of homeless people, poured water on them and screamed that they could not sleep under the bridge. The same officer pulled up to 2 other homeless individuals while they were walking down the street to go to McDonald's with their dog. He got on his loudspeaker and told them to turn around and refused to let them walk to McDonald's, which was in his patrol area. Multiple individuals have told us that Jackson officers will pick them up while they are panhandling, drive them to another town, and drop them off, forcing them to walk back. One man told us the officer took his shoes before leaving. Multiple individuals who panhandle say that Jackson officers will take their money and leave, that they will physically assault them, including punching and kicking them. One man said that for panhandling, he was cuffed and the officer rubbed his face in an anthill. This abuse is obviously cruel and inhumane. It also fails to address homelessness. To the contrary, it exacerbates the problems by ensnaring these people in a cycle of abuse, arrest, jailing, and court fines and fees that they are unable to pay. The homeless individuals we speak with are in a constant state of fear that they're going to be harassed, abused, ticketed, arrested, and worse while panhandling and while simply going about their days. To rewind the clock a little bit, the Black codes passed after Reconstruction provide historical context for what is happening today on this issue. Mississippi used to have a vagrancy law, which made it illegal to be homeless. Specifically, it was illegal to habitually loaf, loiter, and idle in the cities and towns and villages, or any other public place in the state for the large portion of their time without any regular employment. It was also illegal to be a tramp, which was someone who goes about from place to place begging and asking subsistence by charity. This vagrancy law was part of the black codes that was used to sweep black people into the criminal legal system and as a tactic to maintain white supremacy in Mississippi. This law was only repealed in 2018, 2 years ago. Before its repeal, Jackson police used it to engage in the abuse of homeless people that I just surveyed. So moving from the black codes to Mississippi's prison system. Mississippi has the third highest incarceration rate in the country as a result of its adherence to tough on crime, mass incarceration policies like habitual offender laws, and abolishment of parole for many people. While maintaining this massive prison system, the state has spent the last 5 years at least divesting from the correctional system, with spending and staffing declining to unsustainable and dangerous levels. Black and brown people make up 70% of the prison and jail population in Mississippi, while comprising 41% of the state population. So in Mississippi, you have over-incarceration, which disproportionately impacts Black and brown people, and underfunding. This combination, according to 2019 testimony by the former Department of Corrections Commissioner, had created a, quote, staffing crisis, which created a, quote, pressure cooker type situation. The high staff vacancy rates require facilities to remain on near constant lockdown to maintain order and safety. The underfunding results in addition to decrepit and inhumane conditions. In the state's most notorious prison, colloquially known as Parchman Farm, because it was run like a plantation in the first part of the 1900s, there's video and testimonial evidence from January of this year of men walking through standing water in hallways with paint peeling off the walls, covered in black mold, water faucets and showers that do not turn on, and housing areas with no running water or electricity. When you combine all of these factors, you get the inevitable, which happened late last year into early this year, when 18 people died in Mississippi prisons in a 3-month period alone. Many of these deaths were in Parchman. Contraband cell phones recorded scenes inside that prison of fires, inmates roaming freely, and what appeared to be a stabbing murder with no guards in sight. Some examples of death: on January 1st, Walker Gates, 25 years old, was stabbed to death at Parchman during a, quote, major disturbance. On January 2nd, Roosevelt Holloman, 32 years old, was stabbed to death. On January 3rd, Denoris Howell, 36 years old, died of a neck-related injury following a fight. And on January 4th, 2 individuals escaped Parchman, demonstrating that the facility could not control those that were inside. A lawsuit that was funded by Jay-Z and Rock Nation, local attorneys and New York law firm Quinn Emanuel sued the state over conditions in Parchman, which is still ongoing. Adding to all of this mess in our prisons, you have the COVID-19 pandemic, which has only exacerbated problems there. Even in the best of times, Mississippi has failed to adequately protect the safety and dignity and humanity of incarcerated people, and it's only gotten more dire during the pandemic. So, along with partners, the ACO of Mississippi sued the Department of Corrections over 2 facilities' inadequate protection of incarcerated people from COVID-19. So, all the precautions that we're told to take for COVID-19, whether that's social distancing, personal hygiene, cleaning services, getting quick access to medical care, is not available to incarcerated people in Mississippi, and also, in prisons across the country. Indeed, some of the worst outbreaks for COVID have been in correctional facilities in the United States. And to dispel the idea that this is a sealed environment and that an outbreak stays in a prison, that is not true. People come in and out of these facilities every day, staff members, medical professionals, so an outbreak in the facility will very likely be brought into the surrounding communities. So lawsuits have their importance, and we will continue to use them. However, they're not going to solve the problems in our prisons in Mississippi. Rather, the solution lies in safely reducing the prison population so that those that remain can be incarcerated humanely and safely. So in conclusion, using the police to deal with homelessness in Jackson and the horrific conditions of our prisons in Mississippi are two examples of the issues that the nation is discussing now with regards to police and racism and racial inequalities. I'll turn it back over to you, Eric.
Thanks, Josh. And now I'm happy to bring on Mark Dones, the Executive Director of the National Innovation Service. I've been working with Mark for a number of years, started when he was at Spark, where he was focusing on bringing a racial equity lens to the issues of homelessness. He's had experience in government before that, working on youth homelessness issues in the Deval Patrick administration in Massachusetts, and has a wealth of expertise to share with us. So I'll turn it over to you, Mark.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me today. So I want to focus on solutions, right? And what I'd like to architect is the possibility of a non-carceral world. And when I say a non-carceral world, what I mean is a world in which our response to problems is not to lock people up. And right, I want to think about specifically the ways in which racism and violence and the death of Black people, right, like that is the engine that this country in fact runs on. And when we talk about dismantling a police state, we are in fact also talking about dismantling white supremacy and creating a world, right, that is oriented towards the liberation of all folks. So I'm going to do this in sort of two ways. One, you know, my team and I recently put together sort of a 6-step guide for how to defund your police. And then I also want to talk a little bit about some of my experiences that Eric mentioned. Before I sort of dive into this, I want to be super clear that when I say, like, here's the 6-step way to defund your police department, none of this is not easy, right? Like, I'm not saying, like, here are 6 steps and, you know, so you should be done by lunch. Each one of these is a body of work. But what I'm saying and what my team is saying is that this work is necessary if we are actually going to see a different world, right? And what I would argue is that we are in a moment in this country, to Carlton's point, right? We're in a moment in this country where there is a visionary possibility in front of us, and then there is business as usual. And what I would submit is that we are in an unprecedented time, right? We are in a pandemic. That's what every commercial tells you, right? Every commercial comes on your TV and is like, now more than ever. So now more than ever, what I would say is that in this particular moment, right, it is time for us to realize in a pandemic, careening into maybe the worst economic crisis that we've ever faced, there actually isn't enough time, right? Or there isn't enough latitude for us to be anything less than visionary. And that in fact, right, if you cannot be visionary, now is the time to abdicate your seat. You should let somebody else lead, because the next steps are steps that require bravery, require us to wrestle complex issues to the ground and finally actually face some of the stuff that is deep inside America that we have avoided up until now. So that being said, I also would like to start with a brief story. It's not a story that I tell often. It is the story of me. I was once younger, and when I was younger, I had, it turns out, a lot of mental health issues. I still do, but I also have medication now and also therapy. You should all go to therapy. And in that time, right, I was hospitalized twice. And one of those times, the police came. And I'm telling this story because of how the police responded to me, which is I was having a florid psychotic episode. I was in a bathtub full of water. I was threatening to kill myself with a knife. And the police response was to tase me twice in a bathtub full of water. There is actually probably no reason why I should be here having this conversation with you. I probably should have died there, but I didn't. And that's cool. Other people did. That's the point, right? every time someone gets out of a moment with the police, every time an interaction doesn't end in death, we celebrate it. That's an unacceptable institution. An institution where there are so many deaths that we celebrate the times you manage to survive is not an institution that helps people. It is, in fact, a menace. And it's time to just have that conversation. So when we talk about defunding the police, right, what I want to say is that the first thing is that defund means defund. I do not mean like introduce smart guns. I do not mean body cams. I mean defund the police. And the reason that I want to be really clear about this is because oftentimes when the police really mess up, what they wind up getting is budget increases for training, for technology, for additional resources, right? Because we have this idea that the institution is not broken, that if we apply enough corrective force, right, we will find the thing that works. And I think what we have to realize is that that isn't true. In fact, when we look at the data, there is no evidence, in fact, right, that use of force continuums, that bans on chokeholds, that the introduction of body cams does anything to actually reduce police violence. In fact, the only thing that body cams have given us is proof that the violence happens. It hasn't actually slowed down the rates. And so if, again, we're looking for solutions, I would suggest that anything that publicizes violence but doesn't solve the violence itself is not a solution. So we actually need to defund the police. And so what we're proposing is legislation, right, that automatically defunds the police budget by half every year. And that is on city councils and county councils to introduce that legislation. And I think that the other thing that I would say, and you know, I want to highlight this because I think that like oftentimes when we have this you know, all cops are bad, like that rhetoric, which I'm not, you know, for my organizing friends, I'm not disputing that rhetoric. We good. But I want to own that inside that institution, the people who are officers are also harmed. And I say that because I think of the officers who came into my bathroom and tased me in a bathtub full of water. Anyone who's in a situation that allows them to so violently disassociate, to not see the person in front of them, right? I'm thinking of the video of the officers in Buffalo who shoved that elderly man to the ground, and then every officer who marches over his body while he bleeds on the ground, right? That is harm to them. And when we talk about defunding the police, one of the budget line items we will have to create is one that pays for the 10 years of therapy that everybody's going to need for having been an officer, for having been inside an institution that asks them to not recognize the humanity of the people around them. The next thing that I want to highlight, right, is that the movement out of police budgets has to be matched, as other folks have said, with funding for supports in communities of color. And I want to specify communities of color. I don't want, you know, it's really important that this be a divest invest strategy and that the investments happen in the communities that have been most impacted, most marginalized, most harmed by the policies of this country. When we talk about a divest invest strategy, the other historical example briefly, once upon a time, we divested massively from a horrible state-run mental health system, and we talked big at the time about all the community-based supports we were going to stand up. Those never came to pass. We did infrastructure work, we moved money into policing, but we never actually created the supports that people need. So oftentimes when we have these conversations about folks with severe mental health issues, right, who are outside, right, who don't have the supports they need, it's because when we divested from those other state hospitals, we moved money into policing, not into community supports. We cannot afford to do that again. So we actually must make sure that when we are pulling money out of police budgets, we are putting it into housing, healthcare, and basic needs support for communities. And, right, like as was highlighted earlier, like most communities spend between 20 and 40-some%, sometimes over 50% of their annual budgets on policing. This country spends annually about $100 billion on policing. That's before you get to the rest of the system, the jails, the prisons. Like, so when we talk about, that's an incredible amount of resources, right? That is enough to end homelessness in this country. All this conversation about how could we end homelessness, the money is there. It's being spent on non-solutions. The third thing I think we need to do is think about accountability and liability. So for the duration of policing, and I want to say duration because this is not to say like, oh, well, you know, this is a stopgap. No, defund means defund. That was one. But while we are still doing policing, I think it's important to recognize that the majority of police serve outside of the jurisdictions where they actually provide their service, right? Meaning, if I work 1,600 miles away, right, and I don't actually have to look anyone in the eye when I finish that job, right? If I work 50, 60, 80 miles away and then I drive home and I'm not accountable to the people who I interacted with all day, that's a real problem. This idea, right, of like the folksy town sheriff, that is a myth. That is not an actual thing that exists in most places in this country. And we could look at Minneapolis and see that the recent audit that they did, I think a year ago, before the current moment, right, actually showed that only about 8% of officers working in Minneapolis lived in Minneapolis. That's a problem. The next thing that I would say is just that we need to be thinking about liability. And so, you know, for the legal folks, I think most of you, right, what's really important to know about policing is that you can't really be held accountable for anything you do, right? Like you can't be held civilly or criminally accountable. There's a thing, an immunity that is granted to police that simply doesn't make sense. It creates an incredibly asymmetrical power to be able to go into a community, right? Do kind of whatever you want and never actually be liable for it. That has to be removed. We cannot talk about a policing apparatus, right, that could exist for any period of time where you are not individually liable for your actions. We don't let doctors have that kind of liability immunity, right? Like doctors who ostensibly are all there to do the right thing, we still could take them to court and say, we're seizing all your assets because this was gross negligence. You can't do that with police, and that actually doesn't make sense. The fourth thing is, unfortunately, I'm pro-labor, but we need to terminate those police union contracts. Like we can't have those. And in part, right, like that is because police are sent into communities, like as Carlton mentioned again, right, police are the literal outgrowth of local militias and slave patrols. In keeping with this, right, they've been given the same liability waivers and armed as soldiers, but somehow they have unions. The only corollary to the hyper-militarized presence of police, right, are like the National Guard or the military. They do not have unions. Like you do, like if you are a soldier, if you are a soldier in the Navy, you do not have a union. Only civilians working for the Department of Defense are unionized. And so I would suggest, right, that there's actually no functional reason why police should be unionized. The fifth and sixth are pretty simple. 5 is you got to change your leadership. We cannot let people who successfully stewarded police departments to massive expansions, to untold power and budgets, to say like, oh, I'll be responsible for our wind down. That doesn't make sense. So police chiefs are actually going to need to be dismissed. They will need to be replaced with wind down administrators who report to civilian accountability boards. And those accountability boards need to be made up of folks who are from the most impacted communities. And the sixth is we need to demilitarize, right? Like police post 9/11 were given access to sophisticated war machines that have no business in community. I remember the first time I heard of a police department using a sound cannon on a group of protesters, and I thought to myself, why on earth and where on earth did they get a sound cannon? Like that doesn't make sense, right? So we need to make sure that police departments are immediately demilitarizing, and that weaponry is being liquidated, and any funds from that are being moved again into the communities most impacted. That was pretty quick. We don't have a lot of time today, but I do want to again note that like in moving quickly through 6 steps, I don't want to suggest that these are 6 simple steps. Each one is a massive body of work, but again, it is now, right? Now is the decision point. Now is the inflection moment. in history where we have the opportunity to stand for something different. And all those, colloquialisms around, oh, like, if you wondered what you would do in Germany in the 1930s, if you wondered what you would do, and like, now is that moment, right? And so it is upon us, and we have to decide what we stand for. And we have to decide whether or not a country that says whole groups of people literally can be killed wherever they stand at any point in time with no consequence is a country that we will allow to exist any longer. And I would say that we simply cannot.
Thanks so much, Mark. I think that's can't say it better than that. That the way whether or not folks agree with everything that they said, these are questions that we need to have answers for, and that's a part of where we want to go, and understanding that right now we only have a couple minutes left for questions and answers. If folks are able to stick around, we can try to get to some more of them. But quickly before the end of our official time, I wanted to do a quick poll and just ask folks if you learned something today, and if you are going to be able to use that in your work going forward. So I'll leave this up for a couple seconds. We have gotten a number of questions. I'm going to say right now that we aren't going to be able to get to all of them, unfortunately, but we will follow up with folks afterwards. A number of questions about recording and transcripts. I don't know about the transcript capability, but the recording of this will be available if you registered. The email that you registered with, we'll get the link once it goes up today or tomorrow, or maybe by the end of the week. Yeah, there's so that will be available. The slides will be available, and any resources, reports that were referenced. We can also make sure that links to those are included in the follow-up email that you'll be getting. So with that, I'm happy to report that the vast majority, 98%, said that they will be able to use what was shared today going forward. And in terms of going beyond this conversation, one way of getting involved more is to join the Housing That Handcuffs campaign. This is a campaign that has, doesn't say defund the police in its title, but this is what it's about. It's about housing instead of handcuffs. We know it's more cost effective. We know it's more effective. And we know that the outcomes are better for both people experiencing homelessness and the communities that they're in. You can go to housing.handcuffs.org to endorse, and there's research there, there's talking points and other tools that you can use to learn more and advocate in your own community, whether it's local, state, or federal, and gives examples of how we can actually make this happen in practice. Folks can also support the Law Center. We are here doing this work, and we rely on the community to support this work. So if you believe this work is important, we are happy to keep on doing it with your support. My contact information is here, and feel free to follow up with me, and I can get any further questions to any of our panelists. We're over time now, but I have gotten a couple of questions that I'll just throw out to the group quickly. In terms of specifically linking this move to defund the police to homelessness, are there any specific recommendations or examples folks would like to share?
I have to run. I will confess that I'm late to something else, but I designed with a team of folks a program that we talk about in the platform that we have linked on the NIS website called Safe and Successful Youth. And in that program, right, like we targeted resources towards young gang-involved men and who had committed violent crimes. And there are, like you can see, it was evaluated. There are statistically significant drops in violent crime in communities, right, where we applied where the program was operating. And the defining feature of it was that there was no police contact, right? And I think the last thing that I will say before I run is that broadly speaking, like folks don't just wake up and do crime. Like it's not a thing. How people survive, right? And often what crime is a response to a flaw in our society. It's not a flaw in the person. And we have to remember that, and we have to internalize that in the next wave of policy making to come. And apologies for not being able to stay. I really appreciate the time, and please feel free to be in touch if you have any other questions. And thanks so much, Eric. Bye.
Thank you, Eric. Does anybody else want to have a comment?
Well, yeah, I'm sure we're going to discuss it, within the Law Center specifics, but for defunding police departments, that's a local, city by city, state by state initiative, and so any specific allocation that would go to that municipality or that locality, we would have to work with the boots that are on the ground that could, make those suggestions about where they go. So if you're wondering what to do in your area, is get with some of the advocates that are in that area that I'm sure have a number of suggestions that will be able to tell you what works best for them.
Anything else? I think that's some folks have asked about the kind of prevalence of different constructive practices within police departments using crisis intervention training. I do know that there are a number of police departments that have implemented crisis intervention training. There are a number of police departments that already do partner with social workers and that have homeless outreach teams and things like that, where law enforcement officers are going out and doing social work. And I think the response to that is, as an interim measure, that may have assets, but the bigger picture is that police departments shouldn't be running homeless outreach in the first place. The reason that they largely are is because they've been tasked with being the front line inappropriately of our community's response to homelessness, and so this is what they've come up with internally, because they've realized and understood that it doesn't make sense for them to keep picking up the same people, turning them through the justice system, and seeing them go back out on the streets now with an arrest record or fines and fees that are only going to be a further barrier to them exiting homelessness. And so that's their own frustration that has led them to develop these alternatives. But most police did not join the force in order to harass people experiencing homelessness. That's not what they want to be doing, but that's what they're being ordered to do by elected officials in communities because they are using the police in order to mask the problem that they don't want to deal with, which is that they, the elected officials, have not produced the adequate amounts of affordable housing and other healthcare and met the other healthcare needs in their communities. And so it's time to redirect that funding to the places where it's more appropriate, so that we can actually solve these problems rather than just push them out of public view. Anybody else want to make any final comments? All right. Well, thank you again to all of our presenters. I apologize again for not being able to get to all the questions. We will follow up by email, and we look forward to seeing you on our next webinar, which will be in 2 weeks, and we'll focus on renters' rights in the context of the COVID crisis. Thanks so much.